Thursday the 8th. We now are convinced the captain hath no intention of going southward, notwithstanding he has lately given his word and honor that he would. Therefore, Captain Pemberton, in order to put an end to all future obstructions, demanded our assistance to make him a prisoner for the shooting of Mr. Cousins, intending to carry him as such to England, at the time to confine Lieutenant Hamilton with him, which was readily agreed to by the whole body. It was reckoned dangerous to suffer the captain any longer to enjoy liberty. Therefore, the lieutenant, gunner, carpenter, and Mr. Jones the mate resolved next morning to surprise him in his bed. I am sick again, which seems to be a common occurrence whenever I'm doing a book review. But today I wanted to review David Grann's book, The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny and Murder. This startling true story that inspired poets, authors, and philosophers, David Grann's book, The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder, is a nuanced depiction of the lives and deaths of the men aboard the British man-o'-war, the HMS Wager, both gripping and at times nauseating with depictions of disease, unanesthetized surgery, and the trials of Wager Island. The unique grouping of characters, from young boys as young as 12 to aging veteran sailors and cooks aged as old as 82, come back to life through the intelligent and insightful words of Grann's writing. While the narrative begins with some necessary backstory and boasts a large cast of names and titles, the book doesn't become bogged down in ancillary details. The ease with which Grann is able to transport the reader from modern day to life aboard an 18th century ship, with all of the terror of yet unknown scurvy and the perils of navigation, amongst breaking waves, thundering storms, and hull-shattering rocks, makes this one of my favorite reads of the year so far. I was first put onto this book through the channel Life on Books. As soon as I heard Tony discussing it, I knew I had to pick it up, and thankfully, that same day, I found a copy at my local library. As soon as I cracked open the book and saw the maps depicting their journey, I knew it would be enticing. This was only furthered when I read the opening of the author's note, which states, "I must confess that I did not witness the ship strike the rocks or the crew tie up the captain, nor did I see firsthand the acts of deceit and murder." Being my first experience with Grann, though knowing of his previous work, especially with the recent release of the film adaptation of Killers of the Flower Moon, I was excited to see how his writing would stand up to contemporary historians that I enjoy, such as Erik Larson, of whom I have read The Splendid and the Vile and am planning to read Demon of Unrest. I am happy to report that the narrative was engaging and gave me a similar ease of access to that of Larson's writing. That said, I did have a hesitation going into the book because I don't really have any knowledge of man-o'-wars or ship terminology. While yes, I have seen movies like Pirates of the Caribbean and Master and Commander and read a fiction novel related to ships, I had little experience with day-to-day life aboard a ship or the naval command structure of the 18th century British Navy. Thankfully, any terminology that Grann introduces is comprehensible and generally comes with an interesting colloquialism, such as the phrase for hangings, taking a walk up Ladder Lane and down Hemp Street. Furthermore, with the expansive narrative, Grann is able to thoroughly explain the command structure so that the reader isn't lost among a sea of titles. He does so without excessive exposition, which allows the men of the Wager to easily become recognizable and understandable when it comes to the eventual mutiny ashore Wager Island, or just the day-to-day life on the ship prior to the shipwreck. The journey of the Wager from Portsmouth to Cape Horn is harrowing, especially with the feeling of impending doom, first caused by a delayed start of the voyage, but eventually scurvy and almost constant death, and a rotating captaincy. This becomes even more apparent with the continued lack of proper precautions being taken and navigation with incorrect dead reckonings and misbelief, best seen in the case of Carpenter John Cummins' report of seeing land that went unreported because of a lack of proper navigational charts. This lack of reporting was the straw that really broke the Wager. It gave me a distrust for the leadership of the Wager, especially with the eventual appointment of Cheap, to the point that I was happy when the mutineers overthrew his command on Wager Island. For me, his unwillingness to look beyond his appointment and the strict naval structure caused more harm than good, obviously best observed with his murdering of Mr. Cousins. But at the same time, I can also see from his point of view that he believed the command structure would keep the men alive, because it was what they had known best aboard the ship. Unfortunately, where he truly lost me was his belief that the final goal of those marooned upon Wager Island was to continue the mission of Anson's fleet without trying to reach home first, to the point that they would face death. At some point, you have to cast aside the perceived glory of completing the voyage for the betterment of the men, and in the case of Cheap, his stubbornness to keep to the voyage, I believe, brought about the deaths of a lot more men that could have potentially survived. As an aside, one of my favorite things about history novels is the rabbit holes they can send you down. I'm not sure if that happens to other people when they read history accounts, but take, for instance, this book. I fell down a few different rabbit holes throughout the reading of it. The first was on Admiral Anson's fleet after the loss of the Wager. I think it was really interesting to discover more specific aspects about how they circumnavigated the world, even if the narrative is potentially ghostwritten, or at least confirmed to be ghostwritten. Along with the remainder of Anson's fleet and that story, I also found myself enraptured by the actual accounts of Bulkeley and Byron in a collection of their texts called The Loss of the Wager, the narratives of John Bulkeley and the Honorable John Byron, with the obvious understanding that these accounts can contain falsehoods or aspects of self-preservation, especially in the case of Bulkeley, who knew when he was writing it that he was facing accusations of mutiny. It still gave credence to Grann's depiction of the events and gave the narrative of the Wager a strong sense of well-roundedness without leaning too heavily to one side of the factions. The second rabbit hole, which pertains to my real-life work, in which I deal with geography and maps, was the exploration of the southern islands of Chile on Google Earth to find the exact locations of where all the events were taking place, down to Cheap's Bay and Mount Misery. Along with the locations, I also found myself researching both the Chono and the Coescar tribes, both of whom I had never heard of before, but I found them very interesting because it showed the ingenuity and sophistication of even what could be considered primitive tribes. Their ability to adapt to their surroundings and make use of whether it's the water or the general environment in ways to successfully survive in a climate that is not readily habitable is really a testament to how well societies can develop and adapt to their surroundings. It's yet another reminder of the ability of humans to rise above the challenges of the civilization at that point in time and fight to live. Obviously, in the case of the castaways, their ability to take in what both the Chono and the Coescar are doing in terms of fishing or in terms of just survival in general contributes to their ability to survive on the island or afterwards, in the case of Cheap's group. Third and finally was an immediate and brief exploration of the book that Bulkeley takes solace in during his journey aboard the Speedwell, which is called The Christian Pattern. There was a lot of interesting quotes I found within that text that could be directly applied to the men contained within the pages of the Wager. One specifically that I found of particular interest was also contained within Chapter 23, which is Meditations Concerning Death, which is actually the chapter quoted during Chapter 20 of The Wager, the book, The Day of Our Deliverance, during the Speedwell journey toward Brazil. The quote that I gravitated towards was, "Happy therefore is he who keeps the hour of death constantly in view, and from this prospect of what must come takes care to reconcile himself to it, and to put his soul into proper temper for it, when it does come." As I can only imagine the terror of food deprivation and safety that these men faced on a cramped, cobbled-together vessel, if you could even call it that, being able to reaffirm yourself with passages such as this could give you hope where none else can be found. I imagine it was Bulkeley and his men's view of death that kept them pushing towards salvation. As I previously stated, while I do find the journey of the initial Wager to be harrowing, I think the best part of this narrative is actually once they have remove themselves from Wager Island. I think the events of Wager Island are very interesting, especially the depiction of them eating the dog and just the monotony that their lives turned into on day to day, just trying to survive. But I really thought it was interesting to get back to civilization and then the return follow-up to England, especially in the short depiction of the basically near impossible survival that Cheap and his band of followers faced trying to reach home, including their trials of overlanding with the Chono people and their imprisonment by the Spanish. That, combined with the heartbreaking story of men willing to leave themselves stranded, or, in their case, potentially being left for the betterment of those aboard the Speedwell were tremendous examples of the human survival instinct. Depending on which view you're taking, it could be seen as a bad thing, obviously. The continued journey of the Speedwell to Brazil started to feel more like an H.P. Lovecraft story than reality. At any moment, I thought the men would start seeing Dagon or the Deep Ones, especially when Grann described the paranoia Bulkley was feeling in Brazil when the men were trying to steal his journal. Then finally, with the gathering of everyone in England to await trial, the narrative took on the appearance of a modern-day reality show, with everyone trying to say that they did this and they did that, or they didn't do this, they didn't do that. It felt both juvenile and dangerous at the same time, especially because after seeing these survivors go beyond incredible hardship and return to land proper, they were all still facing the possibility of death. That was, of course, until it was all cast aside for the betterment, again, quote unquote, of the British Empire and to move the empire forward away from the immense loss of ships and life among Anson's and other prior voyages. While the ending could be deemed disappointing from a definitive answer standpoint of who was right, who was wrong, I can understand the desires of the Admiralty from a political view. I think this is perfectly summed up by Grann, who stated, "Empires preserve their power with the stories they tell, but just as critical as the stories they don't. The dark silences they impose, the pages they tear out." My one brief grumbling with the narrative was the recollection of Anson and the crew of the Centurion circumnavigating the world after the loss of the rest of the ships, mainly because I really wanted to reach the point when Cheap and his companions returned to England. I guess I shouldn't really call it grumbling because it wasn't really a true negative. I just, at that point, really wanted to get to the culmination of the story, so having the recollection of Anson and his crew sort of was just, I can move beyond that. I think at one point even I had contemplated really skipping that entire chapter and just moving on to the next one. I didn't, but still, I think that was sort of the one stopping point for me almost. I will say the depiction of the Centurion Covadonga battle made me want to read Patrick O'Brian novels because, from my understanding at least, those are the kind of battles that are commonplace in his book. So I think it would be really interesting to read more about those. All in all, these are the kinds of stories that made me fall in love with storytelling, and the fact that these events, even if we grant the leniency that some of them may have been misconstrued by the author, not Grann, I mean the authors of their accounts, like Bulkley, but just the fact that these events truly did take place are insane to me. I mean, obviously I understand that traveling around the world on a ship, very difficult, but really getting to live within this world, even for a brief time, was very interesting and makes me happy that the worst way to travel nowadays is in a plane. Granted, at this specific moment in time, maybe traveling by a plane isn't the greatest idea. That said, while it may be recency bias, I think The Wager will go down as one of my favorite books of the year. Okay, I think that'll be all for me today. I would happily say that you should go find a copy of The Wager and give it a chance, especially if you haven't tried many history books or nonfiction books. I think there's a distinct difference between a narrative history book and your deep history book, because some can be relatively boring unless you're very interested in the exact details and facts. I think a narrative history book like this, or The Splendid and the Vile, as I said previously, I think they'll give you a very interesting glimpse into history while not being too bogged down in what some might perceive as boring details. If you have read the book before, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening to this episode, and I hope you all have a great day.